I want to welcome everyone to our conversation with Michelle Reid. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Public History Committee for their generous support through the Public History Endowment, as well as to Aaron Kraft and Rachel Bunning for helping to pull this off. And finally, thank you to all of you here at ASU, both in person and online, for showing up. Michelle Reid is the former director of the Heritage Square and Rosen House Museum in downtown Phoenix. In 2019, the Museum Association of Arizona awarded her the Individual Award of Excellence for transforming the Rosen House from a museum with declining visits to being named one of Phoenix's top 10 destinations. After her success at Rosen House, Michelle launched Museum Pros LLC, a consulting firm that helps small museums follow the path that she put in place at Rosen House. And since 2020, she has served as the president of the Museum Association of Arizona. We are excited about what Michelle has to share today, so without further ado, I turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you, Dr. DePay. He and I have known each other for quite some time. We went to grad school together up at Eastern, and so it's just a real pleasure to be here and to see you guys. Thank you. Yes, that introduction made me sound pretty darn good. I like that. I'll have you introduce me everywhere if you don't
We'd be happy to.
Actually, I'm going to pull up my little bit of CV I have here, and so you can see how we got to the Rosen House part. There we go. All right, so how did all of this begin? My background is not exactly traditional for someone who has ended up owning a museum consulting business. I actually started in the US Army. That was right after graduating from here, ASU, with my undergrad in '91. And then I became the executive director of a daycare center. Okay, we're on our way. High Plains Heritage Center, there we go. That's in Great Falls, Montana. And it's a rather odd story of how I got started in the museum world. I loved history. My undergrad is in history. I loved public history. And the local museum posted a job for a collections curator. From my experience, I assumed I was going to be collecting money from people who didn't pay their memberships to the organization. That wasn't the case. I ended up running a collection of about 110,000 objects, worked on exhibits, worked on education, and it absolutely got under my skin. And I was done for. I loved it. From there, I was at the Spokane Symphony. So we moved from a small museum to a larger nonprofit, arts nonprofit, with a medium-sized budget, but a big constituency. And so with each of these progressions, even though I wasn't necessarily in the museum field, I was in the nonprofit field and sort of gaining knowledge. I was a sponge everywhere I went, trying to figure out what the ins and outs were of the business. After that, Eastern Washington University Foundation. Now we have a much bigger organization. We have a lot of bureaucracy, a big constituency. Then I moved down here to Arizona and went to work for the O'Connor Institute. This is the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute. And it's a small organization with a rock star at the helm, pretty much. Again, such an incredible learning experience. And Justice O'Connor is fierce, formidable, and it was incredibly humbling. Then I got a gig at Rosen House Heritage Square Foundation. If any of you are familiar with this, downtown Phoenix, there's the house. That is the Rosen House, built in 1895. It is situated on the last remaining historic block of the original town site of Phoenix. It's a museum. There are 10 additional buildings on that block also to be managed with this organization. And so here again, I got to get back into the museum world, into the history world, and initially I actually started as the director of education. And it seems like every job I fell into literally was falling into. It had a very small budget. When I was hired on, there were 3 staff members, 1 full-time, 2 part-time, and my pay was $13 an hour part-time. I will tell you, this was also in 2011. So it wasn't that long ago, and working at McDonald's or Fry's, you probably could have made more. But it was getting my feet in. I loved what I was doing, and within a few months, I did become the executive director, and then PAL. Then we started with the journey that brought me to where I am today. which was fantastic. I loved this gig. I am not necessarily a Victorian era historian, but running a museum, being in the trenches with a staff was an absolutely invaluable experience. And I loved every minute of it. I loved almost every minute of it. I can name a few that weren't so great. Anyway, that brings us to current. About 3 years ago, I did leave Rosen House, leave Heritage Square to start a museum consultancy called Museum Pros. And it's been quite a whirlwind. I now get to work with, I now get to work with a number of different museums. We specialize in small museums. And, again, the learning has just been a fantastic process. I know a number of you are interested in museum work, studying history, studying public history, and so I have all kinds of pictures to show you the work that we've done in the last few years, kind of what the process is and how this has evolved. But I do want to respond to your questions, both in person for those of you on the webinar, respond to yours as well. So please, if something comes to mind, if you need clarity, throw it up. I'd like to take questions throughout if you have them. On the webinar, I believe you put them in the Q&A, is that correct? Mm-hmm. So put them in the Q&A, I'll be told what they are, and this is a discussion. I can prattle on all day long about what I do. I love it, but this is about you, and I want to make sure that, that your questions are being answered. Anything so far? Anything so far?
Give it a second. I don't think so much.
Okay, throw them out there when you're ready.
I have a question.
Yes.
Through all your different roles that you've had, did any one characteristic or one quality that you possessed serve you in each one?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, I think it's probably something I learned in the Army. Listen, like I said, my background is diverse. It isn't. If any one of you were heading to work where I am today, that's not the path that you would choose. I wouldn't recommend it. But the Army taught me to listen. This profession requires that you meet people where they are. And if you don't know who they are, you can't do that. And so, yeah, be a sponge. You listen to everything. I never walk into a room assuming that I know better than anybody else in there. I listen to figure out where the needs are and then go from there. And that was the case, throughout those nonprofits. My first museum was a nonprofit, and so my background, I was thinking in that direction. And nonprofits have a lot of challenges. Most museums are, some are not. I think we need to throw that out there right away. But the fact is, nonprofits are run like nonprofits, not like businesses. But at the end of the day, a nonprofit is a tax status. It is not a business model. And so, as I was listening throughout those years of my career, it was figuring out how to get to this point to where you can support nonprofits in a way that's meaningful to them. And again, I work primarily with small museums, and I will tell you there's no word more frightening to a small museum board than consultant. Absolutely terrifying. Yes.
So online, Kathleen is asking, how do historians market themselves as capable for a museum or a public history job?
Oh, Kathleen, thank you. How do you market yourself? I think it's in attitude, really, mostly. So if you're asking, like, coming straight out of school and you're wanting to get into a museum job, I have a few recommendations for you. Don't be afraid to volunteer. Knowing what a museum is all about will give you a lot of insight as to whether or not you want to be employed there. And there are some museums where you may not want to be employed. It's a business. Again, some businesses have good missions and good leadership, and some do not. And museums are no different than that. I have volunteered for a lot of museums, and I know there's an argument against that. Don't give away your experience for free, but I don't always agree. I think that you really have a good opportunity to get your feet wet and figure out what a museum is all about. Again, listen, like any job, the organization for which you are applying is having some pain, if you will. I think there's an HR specialist out there that describes the hiring process as painful. They need something. And applying what you know and what you have done to put out that pain is what they're looking for. And so I always recommend that when you are applying and when you are sort of vetting the museum that you want to work for, you approach it as meeting their needs. Yes, we all work for money. Yes, we all work because we want the job and the experience and the fulfillment and the titles. My goodness, the titles are fantastic. But at the end of the day, you need to put out their pain. And so that's my recommendation. The museum world changes more than you might think, and there are opportunities available. There are also a ton of resources. The museum community is incredibly giving. We always talk about our competition in the field, and really museums more have partners. Are you in competition? Yes, but museums partner with one another and staff members partner with one another. And I encourage anyone who wants to get a break in the museum field to connect with museum associations. There are local associations. CAMA is one right here in town, Central Arizona Museum Association, Museum Association of Arizona, Western Region Museums, Mountain Plains, Eastern Region Museums, as well as national organizations. They're always looking for help. They're always looking for people to come on boards and to help with events and conferences. And that helps you with networking, even if you're not very good with networking. You just can't help but meet people in the profession. When you do that, then you know when those opportunities come up. Okay, anything else? All right, excellent. So back to Rosen House Museum and how this all came about. I was loving my job as executive director. I did a lot of different things. On that list, history really wasn't in there a whole lot. The only time I had an opportunity to practice my passion was when we needed an exhibit. Now, the Rosen House proper has permanent exhibits. They've been in there since its inception. Not necessarily good, but that's another story for another time. But there were other buildings, and we managed to grab one of these buildings that had been vacated by a tenant, and it gave us about 500 square feet to do temporary changing exhibits. And that's the lifeblood of museums. If you have the same exhibit for 40 years and someone has seen it once as a fourth grader, they have no need to come back. The same dress is still on display, the same wallpaper is still up. Oh gosh, the wallpaper, that's another story as well. So we glom on to this tenancy and we're going to do a changing exhibit. And that's about the only time I really got to practice what I love, because there was nobody else on staff that did. And that was one of my first lessons in exhibits in small museums, was that small museums do not have exhibits curators. They have some volunteers, they have people who have been to a big museum and liked what they saw, but it was an opportunity for me to practice doing what I had back in Montana. Other than that, I was a CEO. I did a lot of HR. I did a ton of advocacy, funding for nonprofits. We were a public-private partner with the city of Phoenix, and so always getting our message out there, fighting for our place in downtown Phoenix. For those of you who are aware of this block, it is on 7th Street and Monroe. Directly to the south is the Science Center. I love the Science Center, but the Science Center and Heritage Square, directly behind, you'll see in that photograph, is the Children's Museum. The Children's Museum. And so we were a very, very small player on a block of heavy hitters. And even though you would think it's difficult for a 3-story Victorian house to get lost in that mix, it actually got lost in that mix. And so there was a ton of advocacy and marketing work with running that museum. I ran a staff for the first time. In the Army, I had been a platoon leader. I learned leadership, but those are with people who are told they have to listen to what you do. Museum staff, they don't understand those words at all. I tried to call them to attention. They would have nothing to do with it. And so I have a brilliant staff, a creative staff, and they all have ideas about how their job should fit within this organization. And you have to manage that. And you have to manage those personalities and their expectations and find a way to bring all of that brilliance at the table to go in the direction that you need to go. And once you decide on what that direction is, then you have to convince your board that that's the direction that they want to go into, because once in a while, boards get an idea that they want to have their own direction. So it's a lot of moving pieces at the same time, and you're basically a ringleader. Absolutely. I try not to add the word circus, but there were some days when that word would have applied for sure. But it was fantastic. And then, of course, once you have all of those internal players together as the CEO of this big, moving, growing organism, then the people come. And it's a downtown block. It is huge on foot traffic, and people want to see inside, and they want to tour the park, and they want to do things in the park that you may not want them to do. And so, then you're looking to that constituency management piece as well. So it was busy. It was a lot of hours, a lot of events, a lot of people, a lot of meetings, and all of it absolutely positively fulfilling. I still say it was the best job ever. We're getting close on Museum Pros to beating that, but we're not quite there yet, because I really fell in love with the entire process, even though it wasn't necessarily my little piece of history. Anything else now? Okay, so the exhibits, how do we get into this consultancy? I mentioned that we had a tenancy. Whoops. We took that 500 square feet, and we did a couple little exhibits in it. The one closest here, this is a partnership with the Phoenix Indian School. They were building their new visitor center. They wanted to get the word out. And so we took in their artifacts and interpreted the history of the Phoenix Indian School in that bungalow. Lovely. Broadened our constituency. As you can imagine, a Victorian house in Old Town Phoenix doesn't attract a lot of diversity, not a lot of diverse stories in there that we were able to pick out, but we were trying to do that. And so this partnership enabled us to talk about another historic organization that was there in Phoenix the same time the Rosen House was, and start drawing some of those comparisons to the people that occupied the space that we were in as well. Over here, this one wasn't quite as deep. This is an underwear exhibit called Victorian Secrets. It turns out that enormous conglomerations like Victoria's Secret, I don't care if a teeny tiny nonprofit halfway steals their name. They had no need to be bothered with us. But it was a lot of fun. This one actually helped us, because this one was difficult for the board to wrap their minds around. It was out of the box. It was different. It was, dare I use the nasty word, change. Underwear, even though it's a little naughty, was okay because we were still in that Victorian wheelhouse. So as we are activating this space, the whole point was to bring the constituency along with us, to make it easier for them to understand how to be a relevant organization that addresses some of today's concerns and issues. And museums absolutely have the need to do that in very meaningful ways. So I kind of got into this. Like I said, I didn't get to do this very often, but I realized that I loved it. Sir.
Yeah, so one of our current grad students, Diane Ramirez, sent me a couple of questions, and I think this is a good point for one of them. She asks, I would love to find work in a Native American focused museum, but I myself am not a Native American. How might someone who might be considered an outsider approach this responsibly and with sensitivity?
That is a fantastic question. And I am happy to report, I know a number of staff members of Native American museums, and a lot of them are non-Native. The museum community, the professional development community as a whole, is grappling right now with trying to bring up minorities in the profession. There aren't that many, and so there are opportunities like that. Again, I think if you're looking for that kind of opportunity, it's best to network. I know you guys hear this a lot. I did as a student. It's who you know, but it's not false. It's absolutely true. And going and just meeting people at conferences, through organizations. If you're not plugged in to at least the Museum Association of Arizona and CAMA, those are very easy. It is membership based. Memberships are very, very inexpensive, in the $25 a year range. And the professional development opportunities you have once you do that are as much as you make of them. Workshops often have Native museum involvement. And of course, in a number of states, Arizona being one of them, Native American museums really dominate the top of the field in best practices for museums. And we have several fantastic museums, and they do have opportunities. So again, I encourage networking. I encourage reaching out to tribal cultural liaisons. I know that that's difficult. But they love to sit down and talk about what they're doing. Visit tribal museums. We have several right around the area, Yavapai, Salt River, Tohono-O'odham, right outside of Chandler, and then also outside of Tucson. Go, absolutely. That's the one thing that as a hiring manager, I learned from hiring managers I had interviewed in front of. One of the best questions to ask a young student, a young interviewee in front of you is, have you been to my museum? And if the answer is no, your score just ticked off a few times, because clearly you didn't care enough to even see what we were all about from a constituent standpoint. So go. And then when you're at a workshop or at a conference, you can say to that person, I've been to your museum and I loved this, or I noticed this. And so making those connections can be difficult. It feels like a very closed kind of opportunity, but I have found when those partnerships are made, when you break the ice, Native American communities, particularly within their cultural realm and what they put out there as public history in their museums, they love participation. Absolutely. Was there another one, or was that it?
That's it for now.
Okay, very cool. So we're at Heritage Square, we're doing some exhibits, and there's a trend we're seeing here. It's like, oh, people will come to see this. And they have to pay admission, but they don't have to pay admission for this bungalow. Now, this is our little 500 square, they pay admission for the house. So, again, getting back to that entire idea that nonprofits are businesses and businesses need to make money in order to keep their doors open, we wanted to do something in the Rosen House proper. And again, it has to be appropriate, it has to fit. We're Victorian, there's peak wallpaper everywhere. What do you do? We want something popular, and so you grab onto the hottest craze there is out there in the, 14 to 18-year-old girl world, and adults who don't like to admit it. Dressing Downton was a huge exhibit going around. The television show, incredibly popular, and boy, this is our era. This is our thing. We can do this. At that point, as the ED of Rosen House, I had more moxie than I had common sense. And so I reached out to the exhibit curation staff and the development team and the traveling team. And I said, we want this here. I actually went to Virginia on a trip. I visited it there at the Virginia Historical Society. We want this in the Rosen House. Absolutely, was the reply. Yes. We'll get it to you. Absolutely. I got the most beautiful full color brochures and packet and samples and interpretation and price tag. $320,000 for a 12-week rental. 12-week. That's a quarter of my budget to get this exhibit. So I'm at my desk. I'm feeling very forlorn. I'm like, this is not possible. But look, I've got all this information and all this interpretation and a picture of every, wait a minute, I've got all the interpretation and a picture of hold on. So in the true spirit of the fashion world, we did a cheap knockoff. We put together Dressing Downtown, not Dressing Downton again, big companies don't care about little. And we went to the greater museum community to borrow pieces. So again, they sent me the information. They had a 1914 dress. I went to Arizona Historical, found a 1914 dress. Ours were provenance to Arizona, a couple ranchers' dresses. This one has provenance to Hawaii, but worn by an ambassador's wife. This one over here, the uniform of a World War I soldier who had lived in the Rosen House. So we combined articles from our collection with other things that we borrowed. We did not plagiarize, let me throw that out there on the recording right now, but we certainly looked at the way the professional exhibit had been put together and the outline, and we followed suit, right? It was a huge, huge success. Our memberships went up, our visitation went up. We got press coverage out of it. It was amazing. At that point, I had been at Heritage Square for about 7 years, and I was ready for something else. I have some sort of personal rules about leadership, and I do think that turnover is good at the helm of any organization. You know, you kind of get in there, you have your goals, you articulate your goals, you work them, and when you get to that point of success, you turn it over for someone else to start that process again to move the organization up. And Heritage Square needed to continue moving forward. Like I said, when I started, there were 3 employees. When I left, there were 15. When I started, our visitation was in the 3,800 range. When I left, we were just under 20,000. So in short, I had job satisfaction. Even though I loved it and felt like I could still do good work there, I felt strongly that someone else could take it farther than I could at that point. I also fell in love with this and this business model. And I thought, okay, I would like to rent traveling exhibits to small museums. Not only was the price tag of the Downton Abbey exhibit completely prohibitive, but they required security well beyond what we had. They required environmental conditions that I could not meet. They required door sizes that I didn't have in an 1895 house. Physically, logistically, I just couldn't do that. As we were gathering these clothes then, other museums were saying, gee, we'd like to have that too. We can't accommodate high security or high environmental conditions. And we don't have a garage roller door into our gallery either. And so that is where Museum Pros idea was born. So that brings us to exactly 3 years ago. I believe that it was April of 2019 when I devised the business plan. This was not a fancy document. This was a piece of notebook paper where I scribbled down how many traveling exhibits I would have to create and rent out at how much per traveling exhibit in order to make what I was making at Heritage Square so we could make a mortgage, basically. I didn't have any startup money. I just had ideas. I had contacts. I was well versed in the museum community at that point. And so I kind of went out on a limb. Now, I will also just kind of take a step back and say that I am not the breadwinner in my house, or at least I wasn't at that point. And so for me to be able to take this risk was something that I calculated and evaluated and discussed with my family and decided that we could probably do. I realize that not everyone is in that position, but it turned out to be a risk that paid off, and it paid off rather quickly. And so we'll talk about that a little bit too. Yes.
A question online from Ashley. For traveling exhibits like Dressing Downtown, who owns the artifacts, the museum or the consulting company like Museum Pros?
Very good question, Ashley, right? And let me just clarify, you're asking about the knockoff that we did, who owns those artifacts? Because Heritage Square took about half of the textiles in on loan, the lenders owned those. We did not package that one up and send it around. What we did was we did our templates, we took our marketing materials, the list of the artifacts that we had used and where they had come from, and that's what we gave. We did not rent it to other museums, we gave it to other museums. So for example, Arizona Historical Society down in Tucson, about 5 of the textile pieces were from them. We returned their textiles, we gave them that template, and then they just filled in the rest from their own collection. So that one was not truly a traveling exhibit. It was just a model that we had tried because we had a problem not being able to afford what we wanted, and it resonated with other organizations. The traveling exhibits that I do now, we'll talk about a little bit more coming up, but Museum Pros owns those. So, that's, I no longer manage a museum, but I manage a collection now. And we'll talk about the idiosyncrasies of that. Is that good? Did I answer your question? Okay, if I don't, circle back around, let me know. So we're off and rolling. I'm on my own. I'm a consultant. Again, I don't use that word because it's scary, but that's really what I am. I want to specialize in traveling exhibits, and that's my business model. I also thought I was going to have time to garden. I thought, nope, I have no idea what order these slides are in. I thought I was going to be doing research, gardening, building little kiosks. I had this whole idea in my head. What I get is a call from the Phoenix Trolley Museum. That was the Phoenix Trolley Museum. We hear you do exhibits. Can you do an exhibit for us? Sure. Yeah, it pays, right? Do a contract. I didn't know anything about doing contracts. Okay, yeah, we'll do a contract. We'll figure out a scope of work. That's the Phoenix Trolley Museum. There are some before pictures. So they let me come in. This is where their docents are on Saturday mornings, talking about the critical history of the Phoenix Trolley system, which actually was a pretty darn interesting, fascinating urban history. Are any of you gasping or like falling out of your chairs yet? It's okay to say so. I was. This is what we turned that into. Keep in mind, Phoenix Trolley Museum is 2 very small rooms, but it was an eye opener. You look at the outside of that building and I just thought, gosh, I mean, really? And then when you apply some very, very simple principles like scale, color, ADA accessibility, these things that we talk about in class, you can transform something on a very, very low budget. So we had some success out of the gate. There's what I thought I was going to be doing. All right, so up here, look at that, some good research. Look, I've got my gloves on, fantastic. Here's a team meeting. I had subcontractors right out of the chute. We would sit down and brainstorm about marketing and educational opportunities and how to add breadth to all of these projects that were in our heads, but we had nothing else, just in our heads. And then down here, I'm very tactile, and so making mounts. I love making mounts. If you want to be in the museum world, that's another piece of advice for you. Learn how to make mounts and boxes. But what I'm getting is calls from museums saying, would you please do something in our gallery? Here was my second job out of the chute. This is a museum that closed down, literally shut the doors and walked away from 5 buildings of stuff that looked like this. Now, because I'd been in Montana as a collections curator, I had a good idea of how to wrap my hands around material culture, but this was like something I had never, ever seen before. So much for doing research, right? There's one building. There's another one. This frame, that's the Michael's backdrop in it. It doesn't even have anything in it. I will not name names of what museum this is, but like I said, it closed down. Hello. This is another building. This is their exhibit. Apparently decorating was more important to them than any type of interpretation or history or ability to walk through a building. But this was a municipal contract. And so the task here was, can you please tell us what we have? Yes. Can you please tell us if we have any records? Yes, which we did find in 13 binders, handwritten pages each. The pages in those 13 binders represented less than 2% of what was in the buildings actually. And every piece has been inventoried, at least at the box level at this point. So again, 3 years later, we're still working through that. But again, another contract. I wasn't getting the kind of work that I thought I was going to be, but it was fascinating. It was enabling us to continue developing. Interesting. This is fall of 2019 then, and I finally get to do what I set out to do. I am invited to make a traveling exhibit about a World War II veteran, and I got very excited. This was a commission by the Commemorative Air Force Museum, Air Base Arizona, out in Mesa. A woman went to them. She lives in California. Her father, Hoffland, this is him right here, was stationed on the USS Arizona at the beginning of World War II. He was transferred off the Arizona 2 weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The morning of when he woke up, the morning of the Pearl Harbor attack, he had plans to meet his buddies from the USS Arizona to go play ball. And that's what he was getting ready to do when the attack occurred, and he watched his ship and his buddies sink. Right here is a piece of shrapnel that he picked up from the roof of the headquarters building. That's where he was stationed. With his new assignment, all he knew to do was to grab his rifle to go to the roof and to fire at the aircraft that were firing on them. And this piece of shrapnel dropped beside him, and he carried it in his pocket the rest of his career in the Navy, which was long and prosperous for him. But the woman had gone to the Air Base Arizona. She said, I have these artifacts. She had the shrapnel, the book, and there's another book over here. And Pearl Harbor was coming up. This was probably 1st of October when this project was brought to my attention. I do volunteer out at Air Base Arizona, and the director of the museum said, I hear you do exhibits or something. Could you do something with this? And this is what we came up with. This sort of sparked what has happened all the way up to today. This is a shipping crate sourced out of a crate company. Usually they ship motorcycles around the country that we made look like a radio crate. Hoffland was a radioman. This came from eBay. The headphones came from a surplus store over in Mesa. The trunk I sourced at a secondhand store up in Prescott. The label actually has another sailor's name, his daughter. I reached out to her. She's come over and seen this exhibit. And then we did the graphics and put everything together. Vitrine, plexiglass vitrine over here. This is conduit out of the hardware store. When you put all that together, you put paint on it and you put a story to it as compelling as Hoffland's story, you have an exhibit. And let me tell you, there is nothing more fulfilling in the world than seeing a family member, the public, look at what has been created that is so incredibly tangible, and look at other people looking at it and reading it as well, to just bring you to your knees. Again, it's one of those aha moments where I was like, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. The museum world, of course, had other ideas for me, but from that, we started designing another traveling crate, again, using these very compact designs. So, as we're working through this, always a learning process. I'm thinking back to Rosen House. I'm like, okay, I want something that somebody can put in a hallway and not worry about security. I want something that 2 guys can load on the back of a pickup truck and then carry through a normal sized door. I don't want big security. I don't want big environmental requirements. I don't want something to show up in a gazillion crates that you have to have a forklift in order to move. So the whole small museum business model is really what we were after. We'll get back to this one because it's very timely this week, as a matter of fact. But let's go back to then what the museum community wanted me to do, and it was do more renovations. This is another museum. This was my first full gallery reno. So where the Trolley Museum was a couple small rooms, this one is about 5,000 square feet of that and that. Again, we're not going to name any names here. That. So we ended up working on it. Here we are, the entire gallery. One theme you'll find with small museums is, particularly museums run by volunteers. Gosh, this is going to be like online, isn't it? And I'm going to say this out loud. Let me think of my words real carefully here. Some volunteers in museums are hoarders. Simple as that. We'll just leave it at that. As a professional that adheres to museum best practices, you just need to know that. But we're working on this gallery. It's big. Again, am I doing my wonderful research? Am I sitting around collaborating on ideas and looking at color swatches? No, I'm hauling stuff and painting and building plinths and pedestals and the whole 9 yards. This is what we ended up with, though. A story and a gallery that made sense. It meant something. There was a narrative all the way through. The other thing that this gallery created as a pivot point for Museum Pros as a company is realizing what an exhibit is all about. It's about people. You can have stuff, you can have provenance stuff, but at the end of the day, if you don't relate this to people, it means nothing. And you probably have seen those museums. You go in and it's basically open storage. That's what they had before. This is open storage. This is antiques set out in a vignette that's supposed to mean something, but they give you absolutely no information on what it means, why it's important, why it's there, or why you should care. And that's why people go to museums. Why do I care? Old stuff, old people, old stories. So what? Our job as curators is to give them the so what. I always feel like when I start to attempt a narrative, you need to speak to a lot of different audiences. You have to, it's got to be for kids. It has to be for people who know the history. It has to be for visitors who don't. We also have categories of visitors. We call them strollers, streakers, and scholars. Strollers go through in about 5 minutes and they only read things that are bigger than 4 inches. Did I say strollers? Yeah, that was right. No, that was streakers. Sorry, that was streakers. Streakers, 4 inches. That's the one. Strollers. They're going to read some of the signs. They're going to kind of go back and forth. Often young families, they kind of do it disjointedly. Then there are scholars. They're the ones that come in with a red pen and they're like, that sign over there is wrong. That's not the way that was. They read everything. They dig into everything. They ask questions of everything. When you see a docent talking to a constituent in a gallery for more than like 30 seconds, that's a scholar right there, telling them how they're doing it wrong, basically. But regardless of those categories of constituents, I always get back to this. As an educator, which again is what an exhibit is, my job is to show you where to look, not to tell you what to see. And so when you approach a narrative like that, you get some incredible stories. Again, here's another corner of that same gallery. Really enjoyed this one. It was about an 8-month build, a good board, some contention, as there always is, another angle. We added some technology to this, which a lot of museums want. This museum asked for straight history. There was very, very little interdisciplinary narrative throughout that, although the geology of the region did pull in some science, not a great deal. But it was our first opportunity to do an entire gallery, start to finish, beginning of the story to end of the story, and really see kind of where our capacity was. Then we come back to, again, what I want to do is I want to build traveling exhibits. I want to do trunks. And so never one to turn down a challenge. Question, yes.
Yes, so Ashley Online asks, who writes the scripts for the displays? You, the exhibit designer, or museum staff, or it depends?
Good. Thanks, Ashley. That's a great question too. It really depends on the exhibit. Since I started Museum Pros, I write most of the narrative and then I provide it to a team to review. When I take on a job, I always ask, I don't always get it, but I always ask for a guidance committee. Again, I love this company. I am a perfectionist. I control it so it's mine. And yet I have to let go of these stories because the museum is not mine, nor is their mission or their story. And so that's one of those areas where you have to allow them to be. So I always ask for a committee to guide me through this process. I don't always get it. Some museums say, write whatever you want. I wish they wouldn't. It's too much control, too much power. Other museums want to say in everything. Still others hand me a narrative. That's not my favorite method either. It's easy, don't get me wrong. Time-wise, it's faster, but if I, as a historian, don't endorse what that museum has put out there in the narrative, then I run into a little bit of an ethical issue. And at that point, as a business owner, you have to make a decision. Do you want this build? Do you want to give it up? Are you going to explain why you're going to give it up? Again, I have a long career in this field, and I absolutely adhere to best practices for museums. They're out there for a reason. So when I'm handed a narrative, that can make it really tough on me. My favorite way to work, though, is to have a vetting group, a guidance group. They often have someone they call a historian who's done their history in the past, and I take cues from them. You as students will probably do really well with that. Peer review is kind of, you're used to that. Sometimes I get my toes stepped on a little bit now, but I really feel like on a narrative, it's theirs. And so you need to give them some leeway with that. And I do coach them through. If they're putting things out there, the gallery we talked about just before this, one of their signs that they wanted included specifically pinpointed Native American ruins and sites and burial locations, Skeleton Cave and Salt River being one of them. In that particular case, that is an ethical decision where I said, Museum Pros will not do that. If that's something you add afterwards, that's fine, that's on you. But so, it's one of those things, it's a case by case basis. I'm throwing this out there in an hour as in this is how museums work, but in reality, every museum works a little bit differently and you adapt to what they need. So it just depends. I like writing narratives. I like doing research, but it's a process always. Yes.
Another question. So Gerald asks, how big of a role does creativity play in presenting the why in exhibits? And where do you find that balance between being creative and educational or informative?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question too. Holy moly. Gerald, thank you very much. Okay, so the why. I have found that when you approach any narrative, any story, any space, the why comes from the people. If you tie it back to the people, we're historians, we're about people. It's about people making decisions and the consequences of those decisions. Material culture tends to kind of get in the back of museum people's minds, especially if you have a collections background. You're all about the stuff and the provenance. But when you really boil it down to being able to be relevant and meaningful to constituents today, it has to be about people. That usually gives you the why, quite frankly. And again, because I don't want to put my bias out there, it's impossible, but you want to be as balanced and unbiased as you can to allow visitors to make their own decisions about any given story. And let's face it, some of them are darn controversial. That's where more voices at the table helps. And so you start with the people, you write it, you vet it, you check it, and then you have a variety of folks look at it from their perspectives. And that more voices involved in what you do always results in a better product. What was the second part of his question? Oh, the creativity. That's a good question too. It's very easy to decorate and not create an exhibit. I am guilty of that sometimes because I sit in a space and it sort of speaks to me. I know you're going to boo me off stage. That sounds really crazy, but it kind of does. It kind of tells you what it needs. When you're looking at scale and you're looking at the balance of words and artifacts and graphics and all of that, you do have to be a little bit careful. The story has to be what comes through. I did an exhibit at Tubac Presidio, and it's about the community. I am Tubac. And so it's all these stories, these diverse stories about people who have lived in Tubac. And in my mind, I was seeing a mosaic. A town is like a mosaic. And I found this great graphic. And it's a dark space. So at that time, I thought big, bright mosaic graphic. We will equate the building of a town to the creating of a mosaic. Sometimes in a mosaic, pieces of tile get torn off and you just have the grout left, and that would be really deep and meaningful. And it was a great big case, about a 12-foot case by maybe 4 feet tall. And then these stories were superimposed on that in black and white. It's fantastic. It's a beautiful piece of art, but the mosaic completely overtakes the story. So in that particular case, my creativity hindered the point of the case and the point of the exhibit. So it's one of those things where I always say building an exhibit is like decorating a cake. You have to know when to stop. And I would say that's actually true for creativity. And I love decorating the space, but that's not what I get paid to do. Yes,
I have another question.
Jason.
So you're obviously very creative. Some of us don't have that gift. What, in your experience in the museum field, do you have any recommendations for people who aren't super creative? What role they would be good at? If they're maybe more analytical or maybe more interested in the history side of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the exhibit realm, in that particular type of work, there's a place for everybody. You know, exhibits need a lot of different layers of interpretation. That's what makes them meaningful to different types of people. So if you have someone who just really isn't creative, I recommend that maybe you find a role in the technology, or again, in the research, or in the fact checking. But at the same time, I also challenge people, and a lot of people say that to me, oh, I don't know what looks good. I can't build an exhibit. Google that. Yes, you can. There's not one person that if you say, pull up Google Images and show me what you like, what resonates with you, you're more creative than you think. Absolutely. What exhibit have you been to that you walked in and said, wow, or you're drawn to a corner? For what reason? You may not be able to articulate, well, it's the light, it's the color, it's the font, it's whatever, but you're more creative than you think. And you know what you like. As with everything, I don't believe in recreating the wheel. One of the first things I do when someone gives me a subject matter, I go to the web, I go to Pinterest, I go to Google, I have ideas files, I have paper files, I'm old fashioned like that. But, I'll give you an example, Tolleson Library, we're working with them for a Native American pot exhibit. Okay, they have like 4,000. How do you make that interesting? Straight to the web. And when you start looking at things, the ideas start rolling. And so, yeah, a lot of people again say that to me, but I challenge that a little bit. Okay, how are we doing on time?
Got about 8 minutes.
Oh gosh, crud. Okay, so whew, I told you I like talking about myself. So here, back to Air Base, Arizona. They want an exhibit. They don't want to pay for it. I'm a volunteer with them. Big mistake there. No, that's not necessarily true. But they give me some footlockers. Can you make us an exhibit out of footlockers? It's about a World War II B-17 bombardier named Alan Buchanan. We have some of his artifacts. We have his diary. I was going to say no. Really? And I read his journal and I'm like, oh yeah, we're doing this. So we took those footlockers. There's one right here standing up with his leather flight jacket in it. These are his uniforms. Here are 3 others we stacked up. You just turn them into pedestals. We ended up doing this exhibit for exactly $395, and most of that was a plexiglass cover for a Norden bomb site over here. Then a piece of plexiglass right here. Everything else is left over and scrounged from the back room of the exhibit, of the museum. Like I said, it was his journal. This man documented every day of his life as a bombardier, and it was fascinating. It was so fascinating that I spent many, many hours copying it, pushing it together so it would fit onto this pedestal. It's like a warehouse flip catalog that you get, Amazon, $40, and people stand there and read every single word of what he experienced. It's fantastic. There he is again. Next, another big exhibit. This one is in Utah. This time we were tasked with transforming a 1904 power plant into a museum. Okay, we can do that. And we did. Another fascinating story, little known. There was a brilliant scientist named Nunn who actually was pioneering work in hydroelectricity generation. He worked with Westinghouse, and all this happened on the Provo River up in Utah. Little feminine touch there. A power plant isn't exactly feminine at all hard spaces, but the outfit that owned the powerhouse create a home of ideas where they would bring people in and they would show them the advantages of electrical appliances. And so we had an opportunity to, well, throw a dress in because I had to. But again, what it could come back to, the personal stories of the people who worked there. And the power plant was very interesting. The technology was interesting. It was wonderful, but without the stories, it didn't mean much. Here's one of our most recent traveling trunks. So in this particular narrative, I wanted to talk about how we've grown as a company. I do not draw. I do not sketch up. I did not do this. When I come up with an idea, it's in my head. Clients want to know, what does it look like? Well, it's right. You can't see it. It's right here. So I had to employ some help with using SketchUp and getting concepts out there. This was a request to create a Civil Air Patrol exhibit that was mobile, that told both the World War II history of Civil Air Patrol as well as a contemporary timeline of Civil Air Patrol, had a monitor for current media on it, and included a 100-pound bomb. That was our task, our scope of work. Here is the other side, again in SketchUp. And a uniform crate. Yes, they had uniforms that they wanted on there. There's the bomb. That's just a picture of one I pulled again. Google, hello. Here it is being fabricated. At this point, we work out of a 2-car garage for dirty fabrication and a 1-car garage for clean fabrication. And then I have commandeered every bedroom in the house except the one we sleep in. There it is, being pulled together. It was so big it had to be assembled outside of the shop garage. There it is, between my living room and dining room, we were fitting the graphics. And so that night we didn't make it all the way back into the bedroom because we couldn't get there. Here it is in situ at the Air Base, Arizona. So as you see, at this point, we're getting good. The finished product looks a whole lot like the concept did. And it's something where, as a business, I'm very pleased that we've gotten to that point. Here's the uniform crate. The other side, forgive the cord. That brings us to this one. You saw it being fabricated earlier on. This is our first traveler. Again, my business plan is finally starting 3 years into the creation of this business. This is an exhibit on women, young women, college women who took a geography class in Eastern colleges, and then were eligible to apply for civil service positions in Washington, D.C. with the Army Map Service. There were 224 of them recruited to draw maps, literally by hand, draw maps for the war effort. 2 of them are still living. One of them has partnered with us on creating this exhibit to honor that work and tell that story to the greater public. It's timely because on Monday morning, we are packing this exhibit up and taking it to Canton, Ohio to be on display at the Maps Air Museum for B. McPherson's 100th birthday. She's one of the 2 map makers left. And so it's been really special. It took 2 years to get this built. We used a fabricator. Here's the back of it. This is Miss B right over there. This is when she was honored by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency for her work during the war. And it's finally hitting the road, and we're going to see if this traveling exhibit concept that we started with actually works or not. But it's very exciting, and the work just continues. I think that is all I have. Are there more questions? We've probably got just a couple minutes left. Yes.
There are. So Bart asks, attention spans seem to be getting shorter and shorter. I have an 8-year-old. Is that challenge for future museums? Is that going to be a challenge for future museums?
Some, yes. Yes, attention spans are getting shorter. Yes, kids are a very difficult constituent to address. In traditional museums, the way exhibits have been developed, I think that that's going to be very tough. Most old museums I go into, most small museums I go into, the signs are about this big and they're about 655 words on them. I mean, they're just, it's a book on the wall, basically, is what it is. It's a don't touch, don't photograph, don't have any fun, don't laugh. You are here to learn. I am a docent. Gosh, I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to tell you why this is important. I'm going to tell you what this is about. Those museums that refuse to adapt, yeah, they're going to have a hard time keeping up with the current world. anytime, screens are in front of us everywhere. I pulled up to the pump to pump gas, and suddenly some dude from a screen on the pump starts talking to me. You turn on the news. It used to be the anchor, the chair, the background, which was beautiful. Now it is the anchor, 2 scrolls going at the bottom, something coming up over here on the margin. People are blasted with visual cues all the time, and like it, hate it, you have to do good history and you have to meet them where they are. Back to that primary concept. If that's how people learn today, is like this, then that's where museums need to meet them. It's as simple as that. It's hard to do and it's expensive to do. Technology in museums is challenging for a number of reasons. In fact, it's probably the bane of my existence. Most small museums want it, can't handle it, which means you have to provide IT support. That's not what I do. Well, my remote isn't working. Did you press go? Oh, I have to do. Yes, technology is tough. And there's nothing wrong with low tech. You know, one pointer on this, these wings right here, pull in and pull out. That is low technology. But let me tell you, the visitor has the choice to pull it out and look at it and push it back in. That is meaningful. It's simple. The fabricator fought me on that. He's like, it's a drawer. Dang straight, it's a drawer. Things to touch. Most museums have artifacts that they're dealing with. I do a lot of non-provenance antiques on eBay, which means you can touch them. And so in any gallery, please touch. And I say that, I put a sign right there, please touch. I want to make sure that there's stuff for them to do, no matter their age. Parents, kids, we did an AR sand table in one of our galleries. Fantastic. It's interdisciplinary, it's tactile. I carve fossils, that kind of thing. You have a lot of creativity, and sticking to the old way of it has to be under glass and you can't photograph it and you can't touch it. I think you need to think broader than that in today's exhibits. Went back first and then back to web.
Yeah.
Sir.
I'm Matt Casey-Power, so I'm a faculty member in history here. And I have a question, kind of big picture question about students, and some of the online master students are here. Our World War II program, we have a partnership with the World War II Museum.
Great.
For our undergrads, we have a partnership with the Arizona Historical Society. And with both museums, we're talking about how best we can get students like hands-on experience, curation, like some of the more mundane, like sorting and categorizing things. And we want them to be able to do that and get like course credit.
Yes.
But we're also coming up against challenges for what's available for in-person visits, students that can come from on campus, go to the Arizona Historical Society, or maybe fly to New Orleans, right? But most students will be virtual. What are some ways that we can think about in the kind of coming years or now, getting students hands-on experience both in person and virtually as part of our kind of programs that we run?
That's a great question. Yeah, and it's a big question. You know, it's something to definitely be grappled with because it's not easy. In terms of students who want that ticky-tack experience with perhaps building exhibits, museums can often offer that. But again, in my experience, museums having specific exhibit staff, it's not as prevalent as it used to be. There's no funding for that. It's one of the first things to go. But coming in, looking at an exhibit in small chunks. So when you first start to do an exhibit, there needs to be some research. What are you going to do? You know, both in terms of what it's going to look like and what the narrative is going to be. There needs to be material culture. You know, again, an exhibit is about the people, it's about the story, but there has to be stuff too, or else you just basically wrote a book. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But, you know, being able to catalog things or appropriately choose things to illustrate a story. I'm working with the Justice Museum right now, and we're profiling prominent women judges. And it's amazing to me. I'm asking these judges who are living to choose 2 small artifacts that are meaningful to them. They can't fake. It's unfathomable. Do what? That are meaning, like a certificate, like an award I got. No, something that talks about who you are. So students learning how to maybe go through a collection and say, that would illustrate this story and that would illustrate the story. That's a fantastic skill to have, because material culture matters in an exhibit, absolutely. And then, you know, for those students who maybe aren't here, we were just talking about this. For traveling exhibits in particular, museums will want to rent a bigger story if it has a national story or a regional story. But what really drives it home is to have some type of local connection to it. So for students who may be available to go places, I can't travel everywhere I need to go to do the research that I really need to do. But if I had students available or a pool to choose from who may be able to do that and partner in that way, I think we just need to be more creative. We need to think about where these opportunities are and then take an exhibit, completely unpack it and say, I do this, I do this, I do this, I do this. You know, on any given day, I do not sit and do research. I make boxes, I cut wood. I go visit museums and talk to boards. You know, the work is really varied, and I think that there's somewhere for every student with every skill set to fit in, quite frankly. Is there another one?
Yeah, maybe one last question.
One last question?
Yeah. Kathleen asks, who does the 3D modeling and graphic design for you?
Oh, thank you. I don't do any 3D modeling at this point. I don't have that equipment. I do the graphic design very, very poorly. It's something I'm learning. One of my second job, I believe, was with Pueblo Grande. They wanted some posters made, and so I got fancy and I bought the Adobe suite of designing products. And then I sat in front of them and cried for 4 or 5 hours minimum. I've been learning how to design, and you know, again, I rarely start from scratch. I've learned a lot. I'm getting much better. I observe, but the fact is, I don't start. I go to the web and I look for something that appeals to me, a color scheme and backgrounds and the way scale is added. You know, some things are big and then you add in an oval over here or a circle, and so I copy. You know, I mean, I don't exactly copy, but I get inspiration everywhere I go. I'm one of those kind of people when it comes to design work where museum security follows me around because I photograph everything, like the underside of exhibits, the top side of exhibits to see how they're mounted. JCPenney has excellent signs. If you've ever noticed, they're foam core, they're very light, they stand by themselves. Panera Bread, a great exhibit. Street art, color schemes. You know, everywhere you go, if you're interested in this kind of work, exhibitry is incredibly well-rounded. And just again, be a sponge. Glean inspiration everywhere you go. Read everything you can get your hands on. Go to museums. Capture what you like. And then it's amazing when you start looking at all of that after you make it, you've curated it. But when you start looking at it after the fact, it speaks to you in ways that you can't even imagine right now.
Let's thank Michelle for her time and call us to a close.